And I would now recognize Mr. Scott for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this entire discussion is interesting because you get down to the bottom line. If we're going to balance the budget, it's going to require some tough votes, whatever the mechanism is. And many of them will be career-ending votes. In 1993, we passed a budget by the thinnest of margins. One vote could have switched, would have ruined it in the House. The Vice President had to vote in the Senate. He received 0 Republican votes in the House or Senate. There were tough votes. As a matter of fact, when the 218th vote was cast in the House, Marjorie Margolis-Brzezinski was greeted by a chorus of cheers from the Republican side, bye-bye Marjorie. That vote was used to defeat her in the next election, along with 50 Democratic colleagues who lost their seats primarily because of those tough votes. Those votes resulted in record number of jobs. The record economy is measured by the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Republicans tried to dismantle that plan in 1995. President Clinton let the government get shut down rather than sign those bills. The result was not only did we balance the budget, but we were on course to paying off the entire national debt by 2008. Had we not fought 2 wars without paying for it, prescriptive drug without paying for it, tax cuts without paying for it, we would have paid off the national debt by 2008. We'd owe no money to China, Japan, Saudi Arabia. We would have paid off the entire debt held by the public. In fact, when Greenspan was testifying in early 2001, he was asking questions like, what happens if you pay off the national debt too quickly? What happens if there are no government bonds? What's going to happen to investments and long-term interest rates? 2001, we eliminated pay-go, which we had, which meant if you wanted to do a tax cut, you'd have to pay for it with spending cuts. If you wanted to increase spending, you'd have to raise the taxes to pay for it. Pay-go, we eliminated pay-go, passed the tax cuts and everything else, and went directly into the ditch. Instead of paying off the debt, we doubled the debt. Now, at some point, we're going to have to actually vote for tax increases or spending cuts to get the budget under balance. This is not magic, it's arithmetic. Now, if we look at the proposed amendments, one of the questions that's been responded to is, we had all these questions responded to. One question that was not asked is how this proposal will actually help balance the budget. Now, we have been debating the title, but not really the provisions. The provisions of the bill basically, and I'll just dismiss H.R. 1 because that has a supermajority to increase taxes. They'll obviously make it more difficult to balance the budget. But all of them have, if you're going to pass an unbalanced budget, you require a 3/5 vote. And the question is, will that help or hurt passing a severe, meaningful deficit reduction plan? Now, the Clinton budget never got anywhere close to 60%. Ryan's budget, which is the one the House passed, didn't get anywhere close to 60%. If you needed 60%, those budgets wouldn't have passed. Now, we've heard examples of how you do get to 60%. You can pass an $800 billion TARP spending. You can pass an $800 billion tax cut from last December. That got 60%. That's obviously not the direction we need to go. My question is, how is a requirement of a supermajority going to help you get people to cast career-ending votes? Will it be easier to pass the Ryan plan, for example, with a simple majority, or a 3/5 vote in both the House and the Senate? Mr. Greenstein, can you explain to me whether it would be more likely or less likely that a plan like Ryan's would pass if you increase the number of votes required?
I think clearly less likely. In my view, supermajorities, requirements in some states, California as an example, have really led to gridlock, and they have made it harder for policymakers to make the very tough decisions that are needed. We're going to need very tough decisions in the years ahead, whether there's a constitutional amendment or not. The constitutional amendment, I think everyone on the panel agrees, isn't itself something that changes a program or raises
well, let me ask a follow-up question on that. Once there is no proposal on the table, my colleague from Virginia mentioned the Republican study group, which balances the budget in 9 years. That budget to pass would require what percentage under this proposal?
Well, I don't think the
it- it-
proposal.
it would-
The answer is it would require a majority vote. There
No,
were
it would
tax
require,
increases.
it would require the Republican majority, could I have an additional minute, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
The Republican Study Committee, that balances the budget in 9 years, would require a 3/5 vote in House and the Senate to pass.
No, it would require a majority vote because it did not contain tax increases.
It's an unbalanced budget this year,
Correct, correct.
and you're going to pass an unbalanced budget this year. It
Well,
requires a 3/5 vote
again,
under
as I
your
said before, it
proposal.
presumes that you've got to lead, you've got to have a guy, the budget hasn't been balanced in
Right.
more than a decade.
Right, but I mean,
So you got to have a glide path. There's no question about that.
Right, but the glide path requires a 3/5 vote to enact.
No, not until this is ratified.
Right, exactly. If the balanced budget amendment were in effect, the Republican Study Committee budget would take a 3/5 vote to pass.
If the balanced budget amendment were in effect, that's correct, but
Okay.
only
And
if
then the question
we
is-
hadn't been doing the work to get
Okay,
ready
and
for the
and
balanced
and
budget
the point
amendment
is
being law.
that requiring a 3/5 vote to pass the Republican Study Committee budget would make it more difficult to pass rather than less likely. Is there anything in the 3/5 requirement that makes it more likely that a fiscally responsible budget would be enacted rather than a fiscally irresponsible budget? We didn't have any trouble getting 3/5 to pass an $800 billion tax cut late last year.
Right, but it didn't balance the budget.
Oh, no, it made it worse. It made it worse.
correct.
And
That's
we got
correct.
we got 3/5
But
for that.
that would be contrary to this law, and the discipline
Wait
would
a
be
minute,
what happened in the next election.
Where is it in the law? Where is it in the law that prefers a fiscally responsible? Once you get to 3/5 in any budget that's going to pass under this, any budget this year, if this was a law, any budget that would pass would require 3/5. My question is, why is it more likely that it would be fiscally responsible requiring 3/5, or Katie bought a door, Democrats get their spending, Republicans get their tax cuts, and we're further in the ditch?
Because you've got to go face the voters after you've done that.
We face the voters after we cut taxes $800 billion. I don't see anybody that got any pain for putting us $800 billion worse in the ditch from last December than we are today. Who's suffering from that?
No, there was no requirement that the budget be balanced. That's the difference.
And there's no requirement that the budget be balanced under any of these proposals. The only requirement is it takes 3/5 of a vote to pass a budget.
That's correct. But I think it would have tremendous pressure on individual members to go home and explain why they voted for something that didn't balance when there was an alternative offered that did balance and they didn't vote.
You have
for it.
that today. You have that today.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond briefly to that? I think that the 3/5 supermajority requirement, we view that as a bulwark against what we view as irresponsible tax increases. And part of the reason that we hold that view is that even if you assume extension of the 2001, 2003 tax cuts, even if you assume patching of the AMT, revenues will get back to historical average levels by about the end of this decade. And so eventually we're going to get back to average levels of revenue, even if we, again, assume extension of the policies that I know that you're not a supporter of. And so we see this as really spurring the needed spending restraint to be able to bring the budget back in balance.
I don't support those provisions. I support a budget that's $1.3 trillion better than the Republican budget we passed. Because as a primary author of the Congressional Black Caucus budget that let the tax cuts for the wealthy expire, and we came up with revenues to be able to extend by paying for them the tax cuts under $250,000. We extended them, but we paid for them. And we ended up $1.3 trillion better than the Republican budget without repealing Medicare. That's what I support.
I think there's no question that we can balance the budget at a higher level of spending. It requires a much higher level of taxation. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but
Right.
my recollection of a lot of the alternative budgets that came from the Democratic side is that we're talking about balancing the budget at 23, 24, 25% of
there's a
GDP. The
difference
question
between-
is whether or not that's advisable. I would
that's right,
submit that
that's
it's
right.
not.
There's a
but-
difference between a tax limitation, limiting taxes, and balancing the budget. If the society decides, for example, that it wants universal health care and society is willing to pay for it, as the health care reform did, we had significant additional spending and we more than paid for it. Now, unfortunately, under this proposal, you can pass a new spending plan with a simple majority, but then turn around and can't pay for it because you can't get the supermajority to pay for it. That's how you end up in the ditch.
The gentleman's time has expired, but Professor Primo, did I hear you'd like to make a response?
Yes, I would. Thank you. One important thing that a constitutional amendment will do is create a norm that used to be present in the Congress that budgets ought to be balanced. The presumption of a constitutional amendment that requires a balanced budget or that limits spending to a certain percent of GDP is that that is what is expected of members of Congress. Deficits would no longer be the norm, but would have to become the exception. And so I believe that having a constitutional amendment in place will send a very different signal to voters than the current status quo, which is that deficits are acceptable.
How do the provisions, not just the title, how do the provisions of the constitutional amendments actually help get to a balanced budget?
If I may respond, they would help to get to a balanced budget because elected officials would be able to go back to their districts and say, I had to cast this tough vote because the Constitution requires fiscal responsibility. And that's a very different message. So right now you go back to your districts and you say, oh, I had to make a cut to this program, but look, we got some fiscal responsibility out of it. Voters are going to say, but you cut my program.
The gentleman's time has expired. I would just say that we do have a fairly good laboratory to answer some of these questions. That is, in Arizona, we have a balanced budget amendment, and it has, even in difficult moments like this, allowed us to balance our budget and improve our economy. It's worked very well in states, and we do that all the time. So some of these doomsday, when they talk about tax cuts being the problem, that's increased revenue. So I know we're, but in the interest of fairness, I'll, without objection, give the gentleman one more minute.
I'll just ask a question about Arizona. You said you have a balanced budget. Does that include capital expenditures? You have to balance the total budget as these amendments would, all outlays and all revenues, or does your constitutional amendment to balance the budget allow you to borrow money for capital expenditures like all the others?
Just answer the gentleman's question. There are some efforts on the part of the legislature to try to circumvent that, but yes, we have to balance the budget on capital expenditures too, but there's sometimes leasing programs to try to get around that, and I think it's the gentleman's point is well taken. But in Arizona and a lot of other states who have balanced budget amendments that are not able to not only not deficit spend, but they're not able to print money, and they're not able to do a lot of other things that the federal government does, it has worked very well, and Arizona was hit harder than just about anyone in this recession, and yet we are coming out of it very effectively. The United States isn't, and the primary difference is the fact that we have a balanced budget. We have no alternative. But with that, I want to be fair, but if
For one sentence, having not joined the discussion.
please.
All I want to say is, what's the key goal? If the key goal is fiscal responsibility, and we all agree that requires tough choices, regardless of your views on what those choices should be, then I would urge not to erect new supermajority requirements, which will make it harder, not easier, to get the tough choices made.
Well, Mr. Moreland, you have the last word.
I would just respond to Mr. Scott's statement that what would incentivize a balanced budget here is, first of all, simply the requirement that the budget be balanced. And second of all, we view these supermajority requirements, again, as these backstops against tax hikes. You could theoretically balance the budget by raising taxes. You would have to convince more of your colleagues to be able to do that than if you were to choose to do so through spending restraint. I view that as a feature of it. You may view it as a bug. But the requirement of the balanced budget is the most important portion of it because it requires that you square income and outlays, and the question is how do you get to that?
Well, Mr. Chairman,
I don't know how to add anything more to that. I would concur with that. Mr. Scott.
Just very briefly, there is no requirement in these that the budget be balanced. You need a 60% vote to pass any budget that's pending in Congress today. There's no requirement to balance the budget.
Well, with that, I'm just saying perhaps there's an alternative here, and that is to repeal the laws of mathematics. So let's work on that. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witnesses, which we will forward and ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as they can so that their answers may be made part of the record. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit any additional materials for inclusion in the record. And with that, again, I thank the witnesses, thank the members for the lively discussion and the observers, and this hearing is now adjourned.